My mother left me at the freezing train station when I was 13 years old as a sick joke. She and my father literally bet $100 on whether I would freeze to death or figure out how to walk home. I never went back. For 20 years, I built a completely new life. Then this morning, I woke up to 50 missed calls. The private elevator to my Manhattan penthouse dinged, and there they were demanding I pay for the shame I caused them. I am Nora, 33 years old, and a crisis liquidator on Wall Street. I dismantle failing companies for a living. Before I share how I dismantled my own toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to lock the door on relatives who tried to drag you down. It was a typical Tuesday morning in New York City. I was standing in the kitchen of my high-rise penthouse adjusting the cuffs of my silk blouse and reviewing a quarterly bankruptcy report on my tablet. My phone had been buzzing relentlessly since 6 in the morning, 50 missed calls from unknown numbers. I ignored them, assuming it was just another desperate corporate executive trying to stop me from seizing his assets. In my line of work, hostility is just part of the morning routine. I took a sip of my black coffee, enjoying the quiet hum of the city 50 floors below. I had worked tirelessly to earn this peace, fighting my way up from nothing to secure a life where no one could ever leave me out in the cold again. Then the heavy oak doors of my private elevator lobby shuddered. The pounding was aggressive, frantic, and entirely out of place in a secure luxury building. Before I could even press the intercom to call my concierge, the double doors burst open. The building manager stumbled backward, clutching his radio, desperately apologizing to me. He said they slipped past security in the parking garage and forced their way into the VIP lift. But my eyes were fixed on the woman pushing past him. It was Beatrice, my mother. She looked older, her face lined with a harshness that expensive creams could not hide, but she wore the exact same arrogant scowl I remembered from 2 decades ago. She marched straight across my living room, her cheap heels clicking sharply against the imported marble. She did not look at the expensive artwork on the walls or the panoramic view of the skyline. Her eyes were locked onto me with pure, unadulterated venom. I barely had time to process that she had found me after all these years before she lunged forward and slapped the coffee cup right out of my hand. The porcelain shattered against the floor. The dark liquid splattered across my white blouse and pooled onto the pristine stone. I did not flinch. I just stared at her. "Sign this immediately," Beatrice ordered. She reached into her oversized handbag and slammed a crumpled, heavily folded legal document onto my kitchen island. "You owe us this. You owe this family for the shame you put us through. You have been hiding out in the city for 20 years, letting everyone back home think you were some runaway delinquent. You humiliated your father and me. Now it is time to pay your debt." I looked from the stained document to her flushed, angry face. The concierge hovered near the elevator, waiting for a signal to call the police. I raised a single hand silently, telling him to hold his position. I wanted to hear exactly what delusion my mother had cooked up. Beatrice took my silence as submission. She leaned forward, jabbing a manicured finger toward my chest. "You ran off with some boy when you were 13, she sneered, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You abandoned your own family right before the holidays. Do you have any idea what that did to our social standing? We had to tell the entire neighborhood you were troubled, that you rebelled against a loving home. Your sister Caroline had to endure the whispers at school because of your selfish, filthy behavior. Do you know how embarrassing it was to have the police knock on our door asking questions about a missing teenager? We had to lie to protect our reputation because you decided to be a wild child." Her breathing was heavy, her eyes wide with a manic sense of entitlement. She tapped the legal paper aggressively. "Pick up a pen and sign the waiver, Nora. We need that money to fix the mess you started. We need you to clear the path for the real family members who actually stuck around. In my profession, I sit across from ruthless billionaires and hostile board members every single day. I negotiate with people who would sell their own grandmothers for a profit margin. I know how to spot a desperate, failing entity from a mile away." Looking at Beatrice, I did not see a mother. I saw a bankrupt liability trying to execute a hostile takeover. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I calmly picked up a linen napkin from the counter and dabbed the spilled coffee from my sleeve. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calculated precision. I remembered the biting wind that night, the way my teeth chattered as I watched the taillights of her car disappear into the snow. She thought I was disposable. She thought I was just a scapegoat she could leave behind for a cheap laugh. Running off with a boy, I repeated, keeping my voice low and dangerously steady. Is that the story you sold to the country club to save face? I took a slow, deliberate step closer, watching her eyes widen just a fraction as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Or do you mean that freezing Christmas Eve at Penn Station, when you and Dad drove away betting $100 on whether I would freeze to death before finding my way home? The heavy brass doors of the private elevator hissed open again before Beatrice could even process the words that had just left my mouth. My father Richard stepped out into the foyer. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He was wearing his signature tweed blazer, clutching a leather briefcase like a shield, puffing his chest out to project the same tyrannical authority that used to terrify me when I was a child. He pointed a shaking, thick finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the shattered porcelain and spilled coffee at his wife's feet. "You listen to me right now, you ungrateful little brat," he barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of my living room. "I do not care how much money you make or what kind of fancy high-rise you live in. You do not speak to your mother that way. You will pick up a pen, you will sign that release form, and you will do it with an apology. If you refuse, I will personally call the NYPD. I will have you arrested for elder abuse harassment and whatever else my lawyers can stick you with. We are your parents. We have rights. You owe us respect." I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not break eye contact. In my line of work, I dismantle corporate titans who try to use intimidation tactics to cover up their bankruptcies. Watching Richard try to bully me in my own home was like watching a toddler throw a tantrum over a broken toy. He was completely powerless, and he did not even realize it yet. "You want to call the police, Richard?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly quiet and unnervingly polite. "I think that is a fantastic idea. Let us get them on the phone right now. In fact, I can save you the trouble of dialing." I turned my back on him, a deliberate sign of disrespect that I knew would make his blood boil, and walked toward the sleek steel filing cabinet integrated into my home office wall. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The drawer clicked open with a heavy, satisfying mechanical thud. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, yellowed manila folder. Its worn, creased edges stood out starkly against the modern, pristine aesthetic of my penthouse. I walked back to the kitchen island and tossed the folder onto the marble surface. It landed with a loud smack right next to the inheritance document they wanted me to sign. "Since you brought up the police, I suggest you open that," I said, tapping the faded cardboard cover. Richard scoffed, his face tightening with suspicion. "What is this garbage? Some fake legal threat you printed off the internet? You cannot scare me, Nora." "I did not print it," I replied, leaning forward slightly. "The state of New York printed it 20 years ago. That is the official Child Protective Services file from the winter of 2006. Go ahead, open it. Read page 4. Beatrice took a hesitant step back, her hands trembling as she grabbed Richard's arm. Richard stubbornly yanked the folder open, his eyes scanning the first page. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks began to drain away, replaced by a sickly grayish pallor. "You see, I did not wander the streets crying that night," I explained, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel. "When you and Beatrice dumped me at Penn Station in 20-degree weather for a sick joke, I did not try to find my way back to your house. I walked directly to a transit police officer. I gave him my name, my age, and exactly what you did. I sat in a brightly lit precinct wrapped in a foil blanket while the officers tried to contact you." Richard's hands started to shake, making the yellowed paper rustle loudly in the quiet room. "I memorized this file years ago." I continued, stepping around the island to corner him visually. "Page 4 details exactly how you and Beatrice avoided going to federal prison for child abandonment and felony endangerment. You waited 48 hours to call the police. You filed a missing persons report claiming I was a troubled, rebellious teenager who had a history of running away. You sat on your expensive living room couch, cried crocodile tears for the local news cameras, and told the detectives that I must have snuck out the window because I hated your rules. You lied to the state to save your own skins while I was placed into the emergency foster care system." "That is a lie!" Beatrice gasped, her voice shrill and panicked. We looked for you. We drove around for hours. You ran away. I slammed my hand down on the marble, the sharp crack making both of them jump. Do not insult my intelligence, Beatrice, I commanded. The police report is right there in black and white. You left me there. You committed perjury, filed a false police report, and abandoned a minor. I spent 10 years tracking down the original arresting officer and the assigned social worker to get this unredacted file. I have held onto this evidence for 2 decades. There is no statute of limitations on the fraud you committed regarding the child tax credits you continued to claim for 5 years after I was gone. So please, Richard, pull out your phone. Call the NYPD. Let us see who leaves this building in handcuffs today. Richard was entirely speechless. The imposing, terrifying patriarch of my childhood was gone, replaced by a sweating, hyperventilating old man staring at the absolute proof of his own villainy. He dropped the file onto the counter as if it had burned his fingers. He looked at Beatrice, terror passing between them. They had walked into my home expecting to find the frightened 13-year-old girl they threw away. Instead, they had walked into a legal trap designed by a woman who liquidated enemies for a living. The silence in the penthouse was absolute heavy with the crushing weight of their exposed crimes. They had no leverage, no defense, and nowhere to run. Suddenly, that heavy silence was pierced by a sound that made my jaw clench. A sharp, arrogant, mocking laugh echoed from the marble hallway outside my front door. The elevator had not returned to the lobby. The rhythmic, aggressive click of expensive heels grew louder, striking the floorboards like a marching drum. The heavy scent of an overpowering, overly expensive designer perfume flooded the room before she even stepped into the light. "Oh, give it a rest with the dramatic victim act," Nora, a voice sneered, dripping with weaponized condescension. Caroline stepped into the penthouse, tossing her designer sunglasses onto my pristine sofa. My 35-year-old sister, the undisputed golden child of the family, crossed her arms and glared at me, a malicious smirk plastered across her face. She stopped in the center of my living room, crossing her arms as she looked around with a theatrical sigh of disappointment. She completely ignored our father, who was still staring blankly at the Child Protective Services file on the counter, and our mother, who was clutching her pearls in a state of shock. Caroline ran a finger along the edge of my custom velvet sofa and wiped it as if checking for dust. She looked up at the 20-foot ceilings and the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, but instead of being impressed, her face twisted into a sneer of pure disdain. "It echoes in here," Caroline said, her voice loud and grating. "Could you not afford rugs, Nora? Or did this cheap, sterile rental not come with any? I guess this is what happens when you try to play pretend in the big city. You rent out some empty corporate box for the day to impress us, but it just looks pathetic. Drop the victim act and let us get this over with." I leaned against the marble island, watching her perform. I did not bother correcting her. I did not tell her that I owned the entire top 2 floors of this building. I let her live in her delusion, because a crisis liquidator knows that a target is easiest to dismantle when they underestimate you. Caroline marched right up to the kitchen island, kicking a shard of the broken coffee cup out of her way with the toe of her expensive scuffed shoe. She looked at our parents with deep annoyance, rolling her eyes as if they were toddlers who had failed a simple task. "Honestly, Dad," Caroline sighed, slapping her manicured hand on the marble counter, "I told you not to let her drag you into her emotional garbage. We do not have time for this. We did not spend 6 months paying private investigators to track her down to some sad apartment just to listen to her complain about the past. We are here for the signature." She turned her piercing gaze onto me, leaning forward with the exact same bullying posture she used when we were kids. She pointed a sharp acrylic nail at the crumpled legal document resting next to the police file. "Aunt Josephine died," Caroline stated coldly, completely devoid of any grief or empathy. "She finally kicked the bucket 3 weeks ago. And because the old bat was entirely out of her mind, she left a technicality in her trust fund. The lawyers say the estate cannot be fully dispersed unless every single living blood relative signs a release of claim. That means we need your signature to unlock the money." I kept my expression completely neutral, though my mind was calculating every angle. I knew Aunt Josephine had died. In fact, I knew exactly what was in her trust, but I was not going to give Caroline the satisfaction of a reaction. "Why the rush, Caroline?" I asked, my voice smooth and detached. If your life is so perfect, why spend half a year and thousands of dollars looking for the sister you all despise just to get an inheritance payout? Caroline scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Because my husband needs it, she said, her voice dripping with misplaced pride. Andre is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. His tech company is expanding, and we need our $2 million portion of Josephine's money to close a vital round of funding. Not that I would expect you to understand how high finance works. She leaned closer, lowering her voice into a mocking, vicious whisper, bringing up the old dynamics we had left behind 20 years ago. You were always the slow, ugly duckling, Nora. She sneered, her eyes scanning my simple, unbranded silk blouse with absolute contempt. You could not even pass basic algebra in middle school. You used to wear my hand-me-downs until the seams ripped. You have never understood money, you have never understood luxury, and you have certainly never understood business. You are just a runaway who got lucky enough to find a desk job that pays your rent. Do not try to play hardball with people who actually know how the world works. My husband is building an empire. We are not going to let some pathetic childhood grudge stop us from securing our future. I looked at Caroline. I looked at the fraying stitching on the handles of her outdated designer bag. I noticed the slight tremor in her hands that she was trying desperately to hide by gripping the edge of the counter. I saw the cheap, uneven spray tan and the panicked tension hiding just behind her arrogant eyes. People building successful empires did not hunt down estranged relatives for $2 million. People building empires did not shake with adrenaline when they talked about funding. They were bleeding cash and they were desperate. They were drowning in debt and they needed this signature to stay afloat. I smiled, a slow, razor-sharp curve of the lips that made Caroline instantly falter. Her eyes darted to my face, unnerved by my complete lack of intimidation. So I replied softly, "You just need me to sign away my rights so your husband can play pretend in Silicon Valley." Caroline stood up straight, her face flushing red with sudden defensive anger. "He is not playing pretend," she snapped, her voice rising an octave. "He is a visionary. He is securing our legacy. Just sign it so my husband can keep changing the world. Speaking of which, here comes the genius himself." The elevator doors parted with a soft melodic chime, and Andre stepped into my foyer as if he were descending from Mount Olympus. At 38 years old, Caroline's husband was the very picture of manufactured success. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored navy suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly, paired with a crisp white shirt and no tie, the unofficial uniform of the modern Silicon Valley elite. A heavy gold luxury watch peeked out from his left cuff, catching the overhead light as he raised a hand to adjust his lapel. He walked with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who listened to entirely too many podcasts about alpha male mindsets and market disruption. He stepped around the shattered porcelain of the coffee mug Beatrice had knocked to the floor, shaking his head with a patronizing sigh. He placed a steady, calming hand on Caroline's shoulder, pulling her close and kissing her temple as if shielding her from my supposed toxicity. It was nauseatingly theatrical. The shift in the room was immediate. Richard and Beatrice instantly relaxed, their aggressive postures melting away. Beatrice even managed a weak, adoring smile. Andre was their savior, the brilliant entrepreneur who validated their social standing, the man who had brought real wealth into the family. Or so they believed. "Nora, it has been far too long," Andre said. His voice was a rich, smooth baritone engineered to sound reasonable and commanding. He looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured sympathy. "We did not want to ambush you like this. We really did not. But family matters are delicate, and sometimes they require a personal touch." He stepped away from Caroline and slowly approached my kitchen island, resting his palms flat on the marble surface. He looked around my penthouse, his eyes scanning the minimalist architecture, the clean lines, the absolute lack of clutter. Much like his wife, he completely misread the space. Where I saw curated perfection, he chose to see financial struggle. "Listen, I understand how hard it is out there," Andre continued, his tone dropping into a gentle, condescending cadence. "New York City is unforgiving. Rent is astronomical. You are trying to build a life in this little apartment, scraping by, working whatever corporate job you manage to land. I respect the hustle, Nora. I really do. It builds character. But you have to understand the bigger picture here. You have to look at the family equity. I remained perfectly still, resting my hands in my pockets, letting him dig his grave one patronizing sentence at a time. Aunt Josephine passing away was a tragedy, Andre said, glossing over the death of the only woman who ever loved me in exactly 3 seconds. But she left behind capital that needs to be deployed properly. Caroline and I are building something massive. My startup, it is not just a company, Nora, it is a paradigm shift. We are developing a revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm that is going to entirely disrupt global supply chain logistics. I have venture capitalists begging for meetings. We are weeks away from a Series B funding round that will value my company at over $100 million. He paused, making sure Richard and Beatrice were nodding along, practically glowing with pride at his tech bro jargon. This was exactly what my family had always valued. They did not care about quiet competence, hard work, or integrity. They worshipped loud, arrogant claims. They worshipped the illusion of prestige. They punished me for being quiet and analytical, and they rewarded people like Andre for simply acting like they owned the world. But right now, I have the cash flow bottleneck, Andre admitted, lowering his voice as if sharing a boardroom secret. I need liquidity to scale our servers before the IPO. That is where Aunt Josephine's $2 million trust comes in. It is a bridge loan, really. A temporary necessity to secure the family legacy. And Caroline and I had a long talk on the drive over here. We do not want to leave you empty-handed. We want to make you whole. Andre reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit and pulled out a sleek silver Mont Blanc pen. He set it down gently on the marble counter right next to the legal waiver they expected me to sign. If you sign this release today, no drama, no lawyers. Caroline and I are prepared to offer you a very generous $50,000 cut of the inheritance, Andre said, puffing his chest out. He said the number as if he were handing me the winning ticket to the lottery, fully expecting me to weep with gratitude. You can use it to clear your debts. Maybe put a down payment on a modest condo somewhere outside the city. Stop throwing your money away on rent. Let us help you get back on your feet, Nora. Just sign the paper and we can all move forward. He tapped the silver pen with his index finger and offered me a warm, benevolent smile. He truly believed he had won. He believed I was a broken, desperate woman who would gladly accept his financial scraps. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the waiver. Then I looked up into Andre's eyes and I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a slow, razor-sharp curve of the lips that made the confident gleam in his eyes suddenly waver. The temperature in the room plummeted. Andre's posture stiffened, his instincts finally screaming that something was terribly wrong. I slowly pulled my right hand out of my pocket. I was holding a sleek black remote control. $50,000, I mused softly, turning the remote over in my hand. That is incredibly generous, Andre, especially considering the current state of your cash flow bottleneck. I pressed a single button on the remote. Instantly, the automated blackout shades on my floor-to-ceiling windows engaged, dropping down with a quiet mechanical whir, plunging the bright morning penthouse into cinematic shadowy darkness. My mother gasped, grabbing my father's arm. Above the kitchen island, a hidden panel in the ceiling slid open. A massive 80-inch high-definition screen silently lowered itself into the space between us. AI. Andre, I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper as the giant screen flared to life, illuminating his sudden panicked face in a harsh blue light. Let us take a look at your revolutionary code, shall we? The 80-inch screen flared to life, casting a stark, bluish-white glow across the marble kitchen island and illuminating the sudden terror on Andre's face. I tapped the glass surface of the tablet resting in my hand, and a massive scrolling wall of source code appeared on the display. It was followed instantly by a complex web of financial flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and corporate registration documents. Andre took a sharp step backward, his polished swagger evaporating instantly. The alpha male posture collapsed, leaving him looking like a panicked animal caught in headlights. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy sound came out. Caroline crossed her arms tighter, her heavy jewelry clanking together. She let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. What is this garbage, Nora? Are you trying to impress us with some fake graphs you downloaded on your laptop? Andre, tell her to turn this off. We are not staying in this cheap rental to watch a PowerPoint presentation. Andre did not tell me to turn it off. Andre could not even look at his wife. His eyes were glued to the screen, tracking the specific account numbers that were never supposed to see the light of day. "You think I sit at a desk and file paperwork, Caroline?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, metallic calm. "You think I'm just scraping by in the city? Let me officially introduce myself. I am a crisis liquidator for Wall Street. I do not push papers. I dismantle fraudulent companies for a living. When a CEO lies to his board of directors, embezzles corporate funds, or runs a digital Ponzi scheme, the federal banks call me. I step in, I tear the company down to the studs, I freeze the assets, and I hand the remains over to the authorities. I hunt financial predators, Andre. And looking at your portfolio, you are the sloppiest predator I have seen this entire quarter." I tapped the screen again, the source code enlarged, highlighting several distinct paragraphs of text. "Let us start with your paradigm shift," I said, mimicking his deep, pretentious tone. "This is your revolutionary artificial intelligence. I had my team run a basic diagnostic on your back-end architecture yesterday when I saw your name attached to Aunt Josephine's probate file. This is not a machine learning algorithm. This is a string of open-source Python code grafted onto a defunct crypto trading bot from 2021. You are not disrupting global supply chains. You are running a glorified digital pump-and-dump scheme, selling smoke to investors who do not know how to read the underlying data. That is proprietary information." Andre finally choked out, his voice cracking. He raised a shaking hand toward the screen. "You hacked my private servers. That is a federal crime." "It is only a crime if I bypassed security," I countered smoothly. "You left your developer ports wide open because you stopped paying your cybersecurity team 3 months ago. Your lead engineer quit in January and took the encryption keys with him." Caroline looked from me to her husband, her arrogant smirk finally beginning to slip. "Andre, what is she talking about? Tell her she is crazy. Tell them about the Series B funding." I did not let him answer. I swiped my tablet and the screen shifted from the fake code to a sprawling financial schematic. I began crossing-referencing his shell companies with lethal precision, breaking down the jargon so thoroughly that even my parents could understand the depth of his fraud. "There is no Series B funding round, Caroline," I stated, stepping around the island to look directly into her panic-stricken eyes. "Venture capitalists are not begging for meetings. They blacklisted him 6 months ago when a whistleblower reported his fabricated user metrics, so Andre had to get creative." I pointed a single finger at the screen. "Here we have Apex Solutions LLC registered in Delaware. It looks like a standard holding company, except it funnels investor capital directly into a secondary entity called Blue Ocean Ventures, located in the Cayman Islands. From there, the money is washed through a series of decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges to hide its ultimate destination. It is a textbook shell company maneuver designed to siphon funds away from the actual business. He has been bleeding his own startup dry to pay for your designer bags, your leased cars, and the illusion of your perfect lifestyle." Beatrice gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Richard stared at the screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he finally understood that his golden son-in-law, the man he had been bragging about at the country club, was nothing but a high-end con artist. Andre was sweating profusely now. Beads of moisture formed on his forehead, and he tugged aggressively at the collar of his pristine white shirt, as if it were suddenly choking him. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, but the private elevator doors were sealed shut behind him. "You are making a mistake," Andre stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "You are misinterpreting the capital flow. Startups operate differently. We are just reallocating assets for tax purposes. I can explain all of this if you just give me a minute." I smiled a razor-sharp smile that offered absolutely zero mercy. I tapped my remote one final time. The complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts vanished from the 80-inch display. In its place, a single highly classified bank ledger appeared on the black screen. The font was stark and unmistakable. At the very bottom of the ledger, highlighted in a massive glaring red box, was a negative balance. "You do not need $2 million for an IPO, Andre," I said, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with the absolute finality of an executioner. You need it because the SEC is currently investigating you for wire fraud, and you owe the Miami cartel a very specific, very dangerous debt. The word cartel hung in the air of my penthouse like a live grenade. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the low, steady hum of the automated blinds and the erratic, shallow breathing of my father. I watched the blood completely drain from Caroline's heavily contoured face. She slowly turned her head away from the glowing 80-inch screen and looked at the man she had been parading around as a visionary genius. Andre, Caroline whispered, her voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. Her perfectly manicured hands twitched nervously at her sides. Andre, what is she talking about? Tell me she fabricated that ledger. Tell me you do not owe money to a cartel. Andre opened his mouth, but his smooth, commanding baritone pitch was gone. He stammered, raising his hands in a weak defensive posture. Baby, it is just a temporary cash flow issue. I had to seek alternative funding streams when the venture capital backed out. It is a mezzanine loan, that is all. Just a high-yield short-term bridge. A bridge loan from criminals! Caroline shrieked, the volume of her voice shattering the quiet luxury of the room. She closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides and grabbed the lapels of his custom-tailored navy suit. Her acrylic nails dug fiercely into the expensive fabric as she shook him violently. You told me the SEC subpoena was just a routine audit. You swore to me the corporate lawyers had it handled. Is this why you forced me to sign those papers last month? Is this why we have a second mortgage on the house? Richard let out a choked, strangled gasp. You took out a second mortgage on the Greenwich estate. Caroline did not even look at our father. Her eyes were wide with absolute panic fixed entirely on her husband. You said the second mortgage was to scale the servers. You promised me we were going public in 6 months. We have $2 million in equity tied up in that house, Andre. If the feds seize your assets, we lose everything. We will be homeless. Andre's benevolent peacemaker facade violently shattered. He grabbed Caroline's wrists and wrenched her hands off his suit with a forceful, aggressive shove that sent her stumbling backward into one of my leather bar stools. The polished tech bro vanished, completely replaced by a desperate, cornered man lashing out at the nearest target. Do not you dare play the victim with me, Caroline. Andre roared, his face contorting with rage. You are the reason we are bleeding cash. You think my alternative funding was the primary problem. You spend $50,000 a month just to maintain the illusion that you are still Manhattan elite. You drop 10 grand on a personal stylist while my lead developers are threatening to alert the Department of Labor. You leased a secondary Porsche just because the leather interior matched your winter wardrobe. I had to leverage the house because you maxed out 4 different platinum cards in 90 days. I am your wife, Caroline screamed back, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass windows. I have an image to maintain. You told me to act like the wife of a billionaire. I was networking for your stupid company. You are a parasite, Andre spat, taking a threatening step toward her. Do you want to talk about financial transparency in front of your family? Let us talk about where you got the cash to pay your minimum card balances last month. Let us tell your precious mother how you managed to keep your exclusive country club membership active. Caroline's eyes darted toward Beatrice, sheer terror flashing across her features. Shut up, Andre. Do not say another word. But Andre was entirely off the leash. He turned toward my mother, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at Caroline. Your golden daughter here has a dirty little secret, Beatrice. You know that vintage Cartier diamond set you keep locked in the master bedroom safe, the one you plan to pass down to her when you die. You might want to check the safe when you get home. Caroline took the necklace and earrings to a pawn shop in the Diamond District 6 weeks ago. She replaced them with cheap cubic zirconia fakes she bought online. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her hands flew to her throat, her eyes widening to the size of saucers as she stared at her favorite flawless child. Caroline, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with absolute devastation. My mother's necklace. You stole your grandmother's necklace from my safe and pawned it. I had to. Mom, Caroline pleaded, her voice breaking into a hysterical, ugly cry. I had to keep up appearances. The country club was going to revoke our membership. My friends were starting to ask questions about why we downsized the yacht rental. I was going to buy it back as soon as the Aunt Josephine money cleared. I swear I was going to buy it back. You stole from your own mother to buy shoes, Richard bellowed, finally finding his voice. He took a heavy step toward Caroline, his face purple with undeniable rage. We gave you everything. We paid for your extravagant wedding. We funded his fake company. You brought criminals into our lives. You brought the federal government to our doorstep. I stood silently by the kitchen island watching the immaculate, curated facade of the perfect family implode. This was the moment I had envisioned every single time I skipped a meal to pay for night classes. Every time I slept on a cold office floor to finish a hostile audit. For 2 decades, they had relentlessly punished me for not fitting into their pristine mold. They had branded me a delinquent, a runaway, and a failure simply because I refused to play their toxic games. Now the undeniable truth was projected onto an 80-inch screen for all of them to see. Their golden child was a desperate thief, and her visionary husband was a fraudulent criminal tied to a cartel. The entire foundation of their arrogance was built on lies, stolen jewelry, and massive unpayable debt. Caroline fell to her knees, weeping openly, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Andre paced back and forth near the windows, pulling at his hair, muttering frantically to himself about international extradition laws and offshore accounts. Richard was shouting, demanding answers about how much of his own retirement money was tied up in Andre's failing shell companies. But it was Beatrice who finally broke. My mother stood paralyzed in the center of my living room. Her eyes darted wildly from the glowing red negative balance on the screen to her sobbing, thieving daughter on the floor, and then to me, the daughter she had thrown away at a freezing train station, standing calm, successful, and entirely untouchable. The sheer weight of the reality she could no longer deny struck her all at once. The perfect narrative she had sacrificed me to build was dead. Suddenly, Beatrice stopped breathing. Her hands dropped from her throat and clutched tightly at the center of her chest. Her face turned a terrifying shade of stark white. She let out a sharp, ragged wheeze, stumbling forward before her knees buckled completely. She collapsed heavily against the cold marble of my kitchen island, sliding down the side of the cabinetry, her mouth open as she gasped desperately for air. Richard dropped to his knees beside my mother, his face a mask of sudden, exaggerated panic. He grabbed her shoulders, shouting her name as if she were slipping into the light. Beatrice clutched the fabric of her blouse right over her heart, her knuckles turning white. She let out a series of short, ragged breaths, squeezing her eyes shut tightly. Caroline stopped her own crying just long enough to stare at her mother, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in the room. "Mom," Caroline whispered, crawling across the floor toward the island. "Mom, what is happening? It is my heart." Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling with absolute Oscar-worthy desperation. "The stress, the shock. Nora, look what you have done to us. Look what you are doing to your own family." She reached out a trembling hand, gripping Richard's forearm as if it were her only lifeline. He supported her weight, looking up at me with eyes full of manufactured fury. "Are you happy now?" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking perfectly. "You bring us up here just to humiliate us. You dig into Andre's business. You tear your sister apart. And now you are giving your mother a heart attack. Call an ambulance, Nora. Do it now." I did not move. I did not reach for my phone. I simply stood on the other side of the marble island, watching the performance unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing lab rats. Beatrice let out another dramatic wheeze, shaking her head weakly against Richard's chest. "No, no ambulance," she rasped, her voice suddenly finding a surprising amount of strength for someone in cardiac distress. "No hospitals. I cannot bear the public spectacle. I just need peace. I need my family to stop tearing itself apart." She slowly opened her eyes and looked directly at me. The tears streaming down her face were flawless, welling up and spilling over her perfectly powdered cheeks without ruining her makeup. "Nora, please." Beatrice wept, reaching her shaking hand out toward me across the counter. "You have made your point. You are successful. You are independent. You do not need us. But we need you. We are drowning, Nora. And we did not want to burden you with the real truth. We wanted to protect you from the pain." She paused, squeezing her eyes shut again, letting out a pitiful sob. Richard bowed his head, playing the role of the broken patriarch to absolute perfection. "Your father is sick," Beatrice cried, her voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. "He has cancer, Nora. Stage 1. It is aggressive. The doctors here say the standard protocols will not work fast enough. There is an experimental treatment facility in Geneva, a private clinic that uses advanced cellular therapies. But it is not covered by insurance. They require massive liquid capital just to secure a bed. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining my silence. The sheer audacity of the pivot was staggering. Just minutes ago, the money was needed to bridge a gap for a revolutionary artificial intelligence startup. Now it was the only thing standing between my father and a terminal diagnosis. That is why we need Aunt Josephine's trust. Beatrice pleaded, her tears flowing faster now. And not just the $2 million bridge loan Andre asked for. We need the entire $15 million, the full estate. She let the number hang in the air. $15 million. That was the real value of the trust my aunt had left behind. They had come here hoping to toss me $50,000 to sign away my rights to an inheritance I had not even fully appraised yet. They thought I was a struggling corporate drone who would happily take a fraction of a percent just to pay off credit cards. I carried you for 9 months. Nora. Beatrice continued, her voice hardening with the toxic transactional weight she had always used to control me. I gave you life. When you had pneumonia at 7 years old, I stayed awake for 3 nights straight holding your hand. I fed you. I clothed you. I put a roof over your head when you were a stubborn, ungrateful teenager. We gave you everything, and we asked for nothing in return. She pulled herself up slightly, leaning heavily against the marble island, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute venomous intent masked as a mother's love. Family blood is a sacred bond, Nora Beatrice said, her voice dropping to an intense, desperate whisper. You owe me for the life you have. You owe your father for every meal he put on your table. You can keep your penthouse. You can keep your fancy Wall Street job. But you will sign that release right now. You will sign over the full $15 million and you will save your father's life. If you do not, his blood is on your hands forever. Caroline was weeping softly on the floor now, entirely buying into the theatrical medical emergency. Andre stood frozen by the window, his cartel debt temporarily eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of Beatrice's manipulation. Richard looked up at me, his face drawn in a perfect mask of tragic, quiet suffering. Sign the paper, Nora, Richard whispered, pushing the legal waiver across the marble counter toward me. He tapped the silver Mont Blanc pen. Just sign it. Let us go in peace. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the waiver demanding I forfeit a $15 million estate. Then I looked at my mother, whose chest was supposedly failing her, whose husband was supposedly dying, whose entire world was allegedly collapsing. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. What are you doing? Richard snapped, his tragic mask slipping for a fraction of a second. I said, no ambulances. We do not need a spectacle. We need your signature. I am not dialing 911, Richard. I said, my voice perfectly level. I tapped the screen of my phone. A blue icon flashed as it paired with the integrated surround sound system, hidden seamlessly within the walls of my penthouse. A medical emergency is a very serious thing. I continued walking slowly around the island until I was standing just a few feet away from my mother. Especially stage 1 aggressive cancer. That must be incredibly painful. It must take a massive toll on a man's physical stamina. I stopped walking and looked down at my mother. The tears on her cheeks had stopped flowing. Her gasping breaths had suddenly become very still. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. Let us consult the lobby audio from 10 minutes ago, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Let us hear exactly how much pain my dying father is in. I pressed play on my phone. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio of my building's security feed filled the penthouse, broadcasting from the high-fidelity speakers above us. Listen to me, you idiot, Richard's recorded voice boomed through the room, sounding completely healthy, vicious, and full of aggressive energy. Do not let her talk. Do not let her ask questions. You push the 50 grand, you make her feel poor, and you force the pen into her hand. If she hesitates, Beatrice, you cry. You do that hyperventilating thing you do. We get that 15 million today or the cartel takes my legs. I paused the audio. The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice remained frozen against the island. The tragic dying matriarch act had evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The recording continued, cutting through the silence of the penthouse with brutal clarity. The high-definition surround sound system picked up every single detail from the lobby feed. I could hear the faint chime of the elevator arriving in the background, but over it, Beatrice and Richard's voices were crystal clear. Richard, what if she actually wants to read the release before she signs it? Beatrice's recorded voice echoed, stripped entirely of its current panicked tremor. You know how analytical she is. She is always looking for the catch. Just tell the ungrateful brat I have cancer. Richard's voice fired back, booming with a vicious, aggressive energy that betrayed absolutely no signs of illness. She will sign it. She has always been weak like that. Always trying to save everyone but herself. Once we get the 15 million, I am putting the deposit down on that yacht in Monaco. Andre can use whatever is left to pay off his cartel mess. I am not losing the Greenwich estate because your daughter married a moron. A sharp, cruel laugh escaped the speakers. It was Beatrice. Stage 1 or Stage 4? Richard, we need to keep the narrative straight before we go upstairs. Make it Stage 1, Richard commanded. Keep it believable so she does not ask for medical records. Just get the ink on the paper and we walk out of here set for life. I reached into my pocket and tapped the screen of my smartphone. The audio severed with a sharp electronic click. The sudden quiet in the penthouse was heavy, thick with the undeniable reality of their treason. 20 years had passed, 2 full decades, and they had not evolved a single fraction of an inch. Listening to their voices echo off my high ceilings, I was instantly transported back to being a 17-year-old girl sitting at their pristine dining room table. I remembered handing over the $12,000 I had painstakingly saved from tutoring and summer jobs. They had worn these exact same expressions of manufactured tragedy back then, claiming my father's business was on the brink of collapse and that we were about to lose our home. I had emptied my bank account, giving them every penny I had to save our family from ruin. 2 weeks later, while I was taking extra shifts at a local diner, I found the receipts for their first-class flights to an exclusive ski resort in the Swiss Alps. They had never viewed my empathy as a virtue. They viewed it as a vulnerability, a glitch in my programming that they could exploit. To them, I was nothing more than a gullible pawn, a convenient piggy bank to be played for their amusement and profit. I slipped my phone back into my blazer pocket and leaned casually against the marble counter. A yacht, Richard? I asked, letting the word ring out in the vast open space. That is incredibly ambitious for a man who is allegedly battling an aggressive, life-threatening illness. Will the experimental cellular therapies in Geneva be administered on the sun deck, or do they set up the medical equipment right next to the wet bar? Richard stood completely rigid. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow wax figure. His jaw worked silently as he struggled to formulate a lie that could possibly counter high-definition audio surveillance. He failed. The brilliant commanding patriarch was reduced to a speechless caught thief. Caroline, who had been weeping softly on the floor over her pawned Cartier jewelry, slowly lifted her head. She looked at her father, then at her mother. The golden child, who had spent her entire life believing in the infallible supremacy of her parents, was finally seeing the man behind the curtain. The illusion of their unified superiority was fracturing into a million jagged pieces. "You lied to me," Caroline whispered, her voice raw and hoarse, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. "You told me we were coming up here to bail Andre out. You never said you were taking a cut for a yacht. You were going to use my husband's cartel debt to manipulate Nora and then pocket the rest of Aunt Josephine's money for yourselves." "Shut your mouth, Caroline!" Richard snapped instantly, turning his rage onto his favorite daughter. His voice was no longer that of a tragic dying man. It was venomous and sharp, dripping with condescension. "You are the one who pawned your mother's diamonds to buy designer shoes. Do not try to take the moral high ground with me. You and your fraudulent husband brought this disaster down on all of us." The unified front of the villains had completely shattered. They were no longer the pristine, untouchable elite of Greenwich. They were a pack of cornered animals turning on each other the second the trap snapped shut. Andre glared at Richard, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You hypocrite!" Andre yelled, stepping aggressively away from the windows. You sit there judging my startup, but you were perfectly willing to use my cartel debt as leverage to steal $15 million from your own daughter. You are just as broke and desperate as I am, Richard. You just hide it behind better suits and country club memberships. I watched them tear each other apart, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the cold, clinical satisfaction of a crisis liquidator watching a corrupt corporation finally file for bankruptcy. They had walked into my home expecting an easy mark. They expected the quiet, forgotten middle child to blindly sign over a fortune out of misguided family loyalty. Instead, they had walked directly into a trap of their own making. I turned my attention back to the woman collapsed against my kitchen island. Beatrice was still sitting on the floor. Her hands were still resting near her chest, frozen in the posture of a woman experiencing a severe cardiac event. But the dynamic in the room had shifted permanently, and she knew the performance was over. The audio recording had stripped away her ultimate trump card, the weaponization of family blood. The desperate plea to save a dying father, the manufactured tears, all of it had been incinerated by her own recorded words. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I looked down at the woman who had given me life, who had spent the last 2 decades ensuring I felt entirely unworthy of it. Your heart seems to have made a miraculous recovery, Beatrice. I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of Richard and Andre's shouting match. It is truly a medical marvel. I suppose we can cancel that emergency flight to Geneva. For a moment, Beatrice did not move. She remained huddled against the marble cabinetry, staring at the floor. Then slowly the illusion vanished. She lowered her hands from her chest. Her shallow, ragged breathing stopped instantly, replaced by slow, measured intakes of air. The tears that had been streaming down her face seemed to dry up on command. She placed her palms flat against the hardwood floor and pushed herself upward. There was no weakness in her limbs. There was no trembling in her hands. The frail, terrified mother disappeared into thin air. Beatrice stood up straight, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her expensive designer blouse. She rolled her shoulders back, restoring her posture to its usual rigid, aristocratic perfection. When she finally raised her head to look at me, the fake motherly love was completely gone. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. Her eyes, which just moments ago had been wide with manufactured terror, were now narrowed into dark, calculating slits. The air around her grew freezing cold. She did not look like a mother who had just been caught in a lie. She looked like a predator that had finally decided to stop playing with its food. Richard's face flushed a deep mottled purple, the kind of hue that usually only appeared when his golf game went south or his high society ego was bruised. He surged from his chair, the heavy wooden legs screeching across the polished floorboards like a wounded animal. He stood a full head taller than me, leaning in until his breath, reeking of expensive scotch and unearned confidence, washed over my face. He slammed his palms onto the marble island, the impact vibrating through the entire kitchen. "You think you are so clever, Nora," Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a potent cocktail of rage and fear. "You think you can use some pathetic audio recording to blackmail your own parents. You are a child playing with fire. Do you have any idea who I am? I have been practicing law and brokering real estate deals since before you were a glint in my eye." He jabbed a thick, manicured finger toward the legal waiver still sitting on the counter. "My legal team at Sterling and Associates are the best in the country. They don't lose. You want a war? I will give you a war that will leave you bankrupt and broken within the year. I will bury you in so many motions and depositions that you will wish you had never walked through that door. We are Aunt Josephine's only living blood relatives. By default, by law, and by every standard of propriety, we are the sole legal heirs to that trust. You are a footnote, a mistake." Beatrice, sensing her husband's lead, quickly dried her eyes, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The fake motherly love, the performative weeping, it all vanished like smoke in a hurricane. She straightened her blazer, her posture once again regal and cold. She walked to the counter, her movements precise and predatory. "Do you remember what happened the last time you tried to defy us, Nora?" she asked, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. "You were 13. You wanted to pursue that ridiculous art program. We told you then that you had no future without our guidance. We were right then, and we are right now. You are still that same ungrateful, confused girl who does not understand how the real world works. You are a failure by birthright and by choice. Richard leaned in even further, invading my personal space until his nose was inches from mine. Sign the release form, Nora. Sign it right now, or I swear to you, I will drag this out until your bank accounts are dry, and your career is nothing but a distant memory. I have the power to make you disappear from this family's legacy. The air in the room was electric thick with the smell of expensive perfume and stagnant, festering hatred. Caroline watched trembling, still caught in the wake of the revelation about her own husband's treachery, while Andre looked like he was ready to bolt for the elevator at the first opportunity. I didn't back down. I didn't blink. I didn't even shift my weight. Instead, I stepped forward. I bridged the gap Richard had created, encroaching on his territory until I was the one looming over him. I felt a strange, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. For 2 decades, I had been the one who cowered. I had been the one who lowered my eyes and waited for the yelling to stop. Those days were buried deep in the ground, along with the girl they had tried so hard to destroy. I looked Richard directly in the eye, my gaze cold and steady. He seemed genuinely baffled by my lack of fear. He expected me to cave, to crumble under the weight of his bluster, just like I had when I was a teenager. He didn't realize that he wasn't looking at a daughter anymore. He was looking at the woman who had spent years liquidating people exactly like him. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the legal document they had brought with them. It was a standard high-pressure release form designed to intimidate and strip away my rights. It was a blunt instrument, exactly the kind of thing an arrogant, outdated man like Richard would use to bully someone he thought was still beneath him. You paid those expensive country club lawyers a fortune to draft this. Dad, I said, my voice dripping with icy amusement. I looked at the header of the document, then back up at his red, congested face. It really is an impressive piece of legal intimidation. The font is perfect, the legalese is aggressive, and the intent is crystal clear. Richard sneered, emboldened by my apparent focus on the document. Then you know what to do. Grab the pen and sign. I ignored his demand, keeping my finger fixed on the very top of the page. But did you actually bother to read the name of the law firm at the top of the header? I asked, my smile finally spreading to reach my eyes. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing as he leaned in to look. Of course I did. It is Sterling and Associates, my firm, the firm I have used for 30 years. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed against the penthouse walls. I shook my head, tapping the name on the header. Take a closer look, Richard. You really should be more careful when your assistant prints your documents. You didn't give this to Sterling and Associates. You gave it to your junior partner, didn't you? The one you've been underpaying for years because you thought he was too green to notice you were skimming off the firm's retainer funds. The blood that had just returned to Richard's face vanished again, leaving him ghostly white. He squinted at the paper, his eyes darting across the printed name. I didn't hire Sterling and Associates to handle this probate. I continued, my voice low and lethal. I bought them. 3 weeks ago, when I realized you were the ones behind the pressure on Aunt Josephine's estate, I contacted their board of directors. I provided them with a comprehensive audit of the firm's finances, including your unauthorized personal withdrawals. They didn't just fire you, Richard. They dissolved your partnership. The firm at the top of that header. It is my firm now. And this document, it is not a release. It is a confession of attempted coercion printed on my own company's letterhead. Andre shoved past Richard, aggressively grabbing the thick, cream-colored paper off the marble counter. He held the document up to the recessed lighting, his eyes darting frantically across the text. Richard remained frozen, his bluster completely deflated by my previous revelation. Beatrice simply stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. Andre's brow furrowed. He flipped to the second page, then back to the first. He ignored the bold law firm logo and focused entirely on the corporate watermark embossed lightly beneath the text, right above the signature line, NC Holdings and Asset Management. Andre read aloud, his voice completely devoid of its usual smooth arrogance. He looked up, his face twisted in utter confusion. What the hell is NC Holdings? Why is a holding company listed as the primary executor on an independent legal release form? I did not answer him immediately. I turned my back on my family, a gesture I knew would infuriate my mother more than any direct insult, and walked slowly toward the custom wet bar tucked into the far wall of the penthouse. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter filled with vintage Bordeaux. The rich red liquid cascaded into my glass with a soft, steady rhythm. I took my time. I swirled the wine, watching the dark droplets cling to the crystal, fully savoring the absolute beautiful ignorance radiating from the people who had once made me feel entirely worthless. Beatrice slammed her open palm against the counter. "Stop playing games, Nora. Tell us what is going on. How does a delinquent teenager who ran away from a perfectly good home suddenly acquire a Wall Street law firm and a luxury penthouse? You had nothing. We cut you off completely." I took a slow sip of the wine. It tasted like absolute victory. "I did not run away, Mother," I said, turning back to face them. "I was removed from your care. Child Protective Services recognized what you refused to see. But you are right about one thing. I had absolutely nothing when I left your house. I was sleeping on a cot in a state facility trying to figure out how to finish high school while working the night shift at a diner just to buy winter clothes." I took a few steps back toward the island, letting my gaze sweep over Richard, Beatrice, Caroline, and Andre. "But I was not completely abandoned," I continued. "Someone came to the facility. Someone who paid my legal fees, secured my emancipation, and transferred me to a private academy in Switzerland. Someone who despised both of you and your ridiculous manufactured country club royalty charade." Richard's eyes widened. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning stark white. "Josephine. Yes, Dad. Aunt Josephine." I smiled, raising my glass slightly in a mock toast to his late sister. "You always thought Josephine was just a bitter, eccentric spinster who spent too much time in Europe because she could not handle the Manhattan social scene. You thought she was weak. You thought she was irrelevant, just like you thought I was irrelevant." Beatrice sneered, her upper lip curling in disgust. "Josephine was a miserable woman. She resented us because we had a family, and she had nothing but money. She resented you because you were a parasite." "Beatrice," I corrected sharply, dropping the polite facade entirely. "She watched you and Richard squander the family legacy on bad investments, leased sports cars and country club dues, just to impress people who did not care if you lived or died. She saw you treating your children as accessories. Caroline was your prized show pony, and I was the defective merchandise you hid in the basement. Josephine hated every single thing you stood for." I took another sip of wine, letting the truth sink into their meticulously curated realities. "When she found out what you had done to me, she stepped in. She became the mother you never were. She funded my education and finance. She taught me how to read global market trends, how to restructure failing assets, and how to liquidate toxic liabilities. More importantly, she taught me how to be absolutely ruthless. We did not just sit around knitting sweaters in Geneva, Richard. We built an empire. We acquired distressed assets, optimized them, and multiplied her wealth 10 times over." Caroline shook her head, fresh tears ruining her expensive mascara. "But the trust, the $15 million. The lawyers said it was locked in probate. They said we had a legitimate claim to it." "The lawyers you hired were taking orders from me, Caroline," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Josephine never put a single dime into a standard probate trust. She hated the legal system here. Before she died, she transferred every liquid asset, every property, and every stock portfolio into a private corporate entity. The trust you have been fighting over is just a shell. It is a shiny distraction designed to keep Richard busy while he bled out his own remaining funds paying useless legal retainers." Richard let out a choked gasp, his chest heaving as the reality of his financial ruin finally settled in. "You set us up. You dragged this out on purpose to drain my accounts." "You drained your own accounts, Dad. I just provided the paperwork. You were so blinded by greed, so desperate to get your hands on Josephine's money to fund your yacht and pay off Andre's cartel debt that you never bothered to do your due diligence. You just signed the retainer agreements and assumed you could bully your way to the finish line." Andre looked down at the document in his hand again. The paper was trembling violently. He stared at the watermark, tracing the embossed letters with his thumb. "NC Holdings and Asset Management." He looked up at me, the realization finally crashing through his thick skull. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I took one final sip of my wine and set the crystal glass down on the marble counter with a sharp, definitive clink. "NC stands for Nora Corporation." I said, my voice perfectly calm and deadly. You did not hire an independent law firm to find me. You unwittingly walked right into my firm. Andre dropped the cream-colored document onto the marble island as if the heavy cardstock had suddenly caught fire. He backed away, bumping into the stainless steel refrigerator, his eyes darting frantically between me and the embossed logo. The silence in the penthouse stretched tight, vibrating with the catastrophic weight of their sudden realization. Richard stared at the paper. His jaw worked silently. I could practically see the gears grinding inside his head as his decades of corporate legal experience violently collided with the reality of his current predicament. Then, like a dying engine sputtering back to life, his chest puffed out. The color returned to his cheeks, morphing from a pale ghost to a flushed, indignant red. He slammed both of his hands flat against the counter, leaning so far forward that his expensive silk tie dragged across the legal waiver. You think you have outsmarted me? Richard barked, a triumphant, ugly sneer twisting his features. You think owning the firm gives you the upper hand? You are just as stupid as you were when you were a teenager. He pushed himself off the counter and took a heavy, aggressive step into my personal space, trying to use his physical size to force me into submission. I did not flinch. It is a massive conflict of interest, Nora. Richard declared, his voice booming with the arrogant certainty of a man who was used to bullying junior associates into tears. You cannot act as the sole legal executor of an estate if you are also the primary beneficiary. It violates every single ethical statute and probate law in the state of New York. You need an independent, neutral third party. If you attempt to push this through your own firm, I will personally see to it that you are disbarred. I will have you indicted for probate fraud before the week is over. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down his nose at me. He truly believed he had found the fatal flaw in my plan. He believed he had won. I looked at his smug, self-satisfied face. Then I laughed. It was not a polite, socially acceptable chuckle. It was a cold, chilling sound that echoed sharply off the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sound was so foreign, so entirely devoid of the fear they expected from me, that Caroline physically flinched, pulling her knees tightly against her chest on the floor. You are absolutely right, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. It would be highly illegal if I were an heir. It would be a textbook conflict of interest that any decent lawyer could tear apart in an afternoon. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to hold his ground or retreat. But I am not an heir, I stated, clearly pronouncing every single syllable. I am not getting a single penny of Aunt Josephine's $15 million. The triumphant sneer completely melted off Richard's face, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Even Andre stopped pacing and turned to look at me, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. I leaned against the marble island, swirling the vintage Bordeaux in my crystal glass. When Josephine first approached me about her estate, her instructions were very simple. I explained, watching their expression shift with every word. She wanted to leave everything to me. She wanted to ensure that you, Richard, and you, Beatrice, never saw a single dime of her wealth. She knew exactly what you were. But we both knew exactly what you would do if she left the money to me in a standard will. I gestured toward Richard. You would contest it immediately. You would drag the estate into probate court, claiming Josephine was not of sound mind. You would tie the funds up in frivolous litigation for a decade, bleeding the assets dry with legal fees just to ensure I could not have them. You would use your country club lawyers to bury me in paperwork until I surrendered out of pure exhaustion. Richard's silence confirmed everything. That was exactly what his playbook dictated. So I proposed a different strategy. I continued, taking a slow sip of the dark wine. A massive, impenetrable legal loophole. I had Josephine legally disinherit me. Caroline let out a sharp gasp from the floor. We drafted a completely ironclad, heavily witnessed document, explicitly stating that Nora Catherine shall receive absolutely zero financial compensation, zero property, and zero liquid assets from the estate of Josephine Catherine. I said, spelling out the legal reality. I made myself entirely invisible as a beneficiary. I removed myself from the equation completely, therefore there is zero conflict of interest. For 2 full seconds, the room was dead silent. Then Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half laugh. The terrified, vulnerable mother routine vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden radiant gleam of sheer arrogant joy. She stepped out from behind Richard, her eyes flashing with malicious triumph. "You absolute idiot!" Beatrice breathed out a harsh, mocking smile, stretching across her heavily contoured face. "You actually let her disinherit you. You took yourself completely out of the will just to spite us. You played yourself, Nora." She turned to Richard, her hands shaking with sudden greedy excitement. "Do you hear her, Richard? If she is not the heir and Josephine had no other living children, the entire estate defaults to her next of kin. That is you, Richard. She just handed us the entire $15 million on a silver platter. She did the work for us." Beatrice turned back to me, her expression dripping with condescension. She looked at me exactly the way she had when I was a teenager, viewing me as a gullible, foolish pawn who had just made a catastrophic error. "You always were too smart for your own good, Nora," Beatrice sneered. "You built this entire elaborate trap. You bought a law firm, you set up all these cameras, and you forgot the most basic rule of inheritance. We win." I let her savor the victory. I stood perfectly still, allowing the greedy, arrogant satisfaction to wash completely over her features. I watched Richard's shoulders drop as a massive wave of relief visibly flooded his body. They truly believed they had won. I set my wine glass down on the marble counter. The sharp clink of the crystal silenced the room. "I am not the heir, Beatrice," I stated, my voice dropping to a dead, absolute calm that commanded total attention. "I am the sole, indisputable trustee of a discretionary, irrevocable trust." The smiles on their faces froze. "I do not get the money," I said, dropping the hammer with surgical precision. "I am the one who dictates exactly who gets it and exactly how." The silence in the penthouse became absolute. The reality of the situation crashed down on them with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. I was not an heir to be challenged in probate court. I was the gatekeeper. I held the keys to the $15 million they were already spending in their heads. Richard stared at the marble countertop, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His entire identity, built on financial dominance and legal intimidation, had just been effortlessly dismantled by the daughter he deemed worthless. Caroline was the first to adapt. The survival instincts of a woman facing imminent social exile and bankruptcy kicked in immediately. She wiped her ruined mascara, pushed herself off the hardwood floor, and took a tentative step toward me. The vicious, screaming woman who had just confessed to pawning family heirlooms vanished. In her place stood a fragile, affectionate sibling, Nora. She began, her voice dripping with sudden, sickening warmth. "Nora, please. We have let things get so out of hand. We are sisters. We have had our misunderstandings, of course we have. But at the end of the day, family is family." I watched her reach out, her acrylic nails trembling slightly in the air between us. "I know I have not been there for you," Caroline continued, forcing a tearful, apologetic smile. "But I want to fix that. We both know Josephine was eccentric, but she clearly wanted us to come together. She wanted you to help us. You know I would do the exact same thing for you if the roles were reversed." Before I could even register the sheer hypocrisy of her statement, Andre stepped forward, practically shoving his wife aside. The panicked, cornered animal owing a cartel millions of dollars was replaced by the slick Silicon Valley visionary. He adjusted the lapels of his custom navy suit, flashing a brilliant, completely unearned smile. "Nora, let us look at this logically." Andre pitched, his smooth baritone returning in full force. "You are a businesswoman. You understand capital allocation better than anyone in this room. My company is not a scam. It is a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform on the verge of reshaping the entire tech landscape. The traditional venture capitalists just lacked the vision to see my long-term strategy. But you clearly have vision." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial, respectful register. "You are not just a trustee. You are an angel investor, looking for a high-yield vehicle for that $15 million. I am not asking for a handout. I am offering you equity. Ground floor equity in a unicorn startup. We can partner on this, Nora. We can dominate the market together." I stood perfectly still behind the island, watching them grovel. The sudden, desperate flattery made my stomach turn. They were showering me with praise, treating me like a brilliant savior simply because I held the purse strings to their survival. Looking at their eager, pleading faces, my mind violently snapped back to a freezing December evening 14 years ago. I was standing on the icy concrete platform of the regional train station, clutching a single duffel bag holding everything I owned. Child Protective Services had secured my exit from their house, but my family had insisted on dropping me off, claiming they wanted to handle the transition privately. I remembered the biting cold slicing through my thin jacket. I remembered looking back at their idling luxury SUV, hoping for a final sliver of remorse or a simple goodbye. Instead, I heard laughter. The windows were rolled up, but the sharp, cruel sound of their shared amusement pierced right through the glass. They were joking. They were celebrating their freedom from the defective child. I remembered watching the red taillights of their car slowly fade into the driving snow, leaving me entirely alone in the freezing dark. Now the very same people who had laughed at my banishment were begging for my grace in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. Richard finally found his voice, though it lacked any trace of its former bluster. "Nora," he rasped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You have made your point. You have proven you are smarter than all of us. But you cannot just withhold those funds out of spite. The estate needs to be distributed. You know how these trusts function." Beatrice, seeing her husband broken and her golden child pleading, decided to deploy her ultimate weapon. She bypassed Richard, walking around the marble island until there was nothing between us. The mask of malice she had worn just moments ago melted away, replaced by the deep, unconditional warmth of a loving mother. Her eyes pooled with fresh, shining tears. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. We were blind. But you have grown into such an extraordinary woman. Let us heal this family, Nora. Let us start over right now." She stepped forward, throwing her arms open to pull me into a tight maternal embrace. I violently pushed her back. The force of my shove sent her stumbling backward into Richard, who had to catch her to keep her from hitting the floor. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice slicing through the room like shattered glass. Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest, genuinely shocked by the physical rejection. The room froze. "You do not get to rewrite history." I continued, my gaze locking onto my mother's terrified eyes. "You do not get to play the loving family the moment you realize I hold the checkbook. The trust has a very specific set of conditions before I can distribute a single dollar of those funds. Care to hear them?" Beatrice stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick Persian rug. She collided hard with Richard's chest, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as she gasped for air. Her eyes were wide, completely stripped of the fake maternal warmth she had tried to weaponize just seconds before. The rest of the room fell into a suffocating, terrified silence. I did not wait for them to respond. I turned my back on my trembling mother and walked across the expansive living space toward a large abstract canvas hanging on the far wall. I pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner disguised within the frame. The heavy steel door of a wall safe clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I reached inside and retrieved a beautifully carved mahogany box. It was an antique, heavy and dark-looking, entirely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern aesthetic of my penthouse. I carried it back to the marble island, setting it down right next to the useless legal waiver Richard had tried to force me to sign. Richard crossed his arms, trying desperately to salvage a shred of his shattered authority. "Are we doing show and tell now, Nora? We are discussing a multi-million-dollar corporate trust, and you are pulling out antique jewelry boxes. This is a legally binding proceeding, not a book club." I unclasped the brass latch on the mahogany box. "You are absolutely right, Dad. This is a legally binding proceeding. And Clause 4, Section 7 of Josephine's trust deed explicitly mandates the vocal reading of the enclosed document before any financial distributions can even be considered. Sit down and listen." I opened the lid. The faint smell of dried lavender and aged paper drifted into the air. Nestled inside the velvet lining was a worn, thick, leather-bound diary. The edges of the pages were frayed from years of constant use. I lifted it out carefully, feeling the heavy weight of Josephine's entire life resting in my hands. "This is Aunt Josephine's personal ledger." I explained, opening the cover and flipping past years of financial notes and market predictions until I reached a page marked with a red silk ribbon. She kept meticulous records of her investments, but she also kept records of her motivations. I looked up, locking eyes with Richard, then shifted my gaze to Beatrice. The entry is dated December 14th, 20 years ago. Does that date ring a bell, Mother? Beatrice swallowed hard, her throat visibly working. She shook her head in a jerky, terrified motion, refusing to answer. It was the night you finalized my removal from the house, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. It was the night you drove me to the regional train station in the middle of a blizzard and left me on the icy concrete platform with a single canvas duffel bag. Caroline gasped softly from the corner of the room, her hands covering her mouth. Andre looked entirely sick to his stomach. Richard's face flushed a deep mottled purple, but he remained stubbornly silent. I looked down at the yellowed page and began to read Josephine's elegant sweeping cursive aloud to the room. Tonight my brother and his wretched wife committed an act so vile it defies human comprehension. I had my private security team trailing their vehicle, hoping to intervene in the state transfer. Instead, I watched from a distance as they dumped my niece at the regional train platform in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. They did not wait to see if she made it inside the station doors. They simply drove away. I paused, letting the reality of her words hang in the air. But the physical abandonment was not the worst offense. My security team had a parabolic microphone directed at their vehicle. They recorded the audio from the parking lot. Before pulling away, Richard took a crisp $100 bill from his money clip. He bet Beatrice that Nora would not last a week in the foster system before she broke down and came crawling back, begging for forgiveness. Beatrice laughed, accepted the bet, and claimed the freezing temperatures would solve their problem before the week was over. I stopped reading and slowly closed the leather cover. The heavy thud of the book sounded exactly like a judge's gavel sealing a death sentence. I looked at my parents. They looked like they had just been physically struck. Beatrice was shaking uncontrollably, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself upright. Richard was staring at the floor, absolutely decimated by the exposure of his own cruelty. $100, I whispered, the icy calm in my voice cutting through their panic. That was the exact market value of my life to you. A single crisp bill wagered on whether or not your teenage daughter would freeze to death on a train platform. I ran my hand over the embossed leather of the diary. Josephine heard that recording, I continued. And on that very night, she swore an oath. She spent the next 2 decades meticulously structuring her assets, buying up your private debts through shell companies, and investing heavily in the exact tech sectors she knew would render your manufacturing businesses obsolete. She did not just sit back and watch you fail. She actively built the financial labyrinth that you are currently trapped inside. I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow sip as I watched the sheer, suffocating terror fully possess my family. The $15 million was never meant to be a gift, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. It was the bait. It was the shiny piece of meat hung over a steel trap that she spent 20 years sharpening. She wanted you to bleed out, paying legal fees to fight for money you were never ever going to touch. Beatrice let out a choked, desperate sob. But the letter, the summons, the lawyers said Josephine demanded all living family members be present for the reading. We thought she wanted a reconciliation. We thought she wanted peace. I let out a sharp, joyless laugh. I placed both of my hands flat on the diary, leaning forward to deliver the final, crushing blow. You thought the mandate requiring everyone to be in this room was a gesture of old-fashioned family unity. You thought Josephine wanted a heartfelt apology before handing over the keys to her kingdom. I smiled, feeling the intoxicating absolute power of Josephine's final vengeance. The diary explicitly details the conditions of this trust, I said, staring directly into Richard's horrified eyes. I am going to quote her final instruction verbatim. I mandate the presence of all living relatives for the execution of this estate. Not to share my wealth, not to foster forgiveness. They are required to attend for one reason only: to ensure Nora has a front row seat to their absolute destruction. The word hung in the air, heavy and lethal, suffocating the last remaining ounces of oxygen in the room. Destruction. It was not a legal term. It was not a financial penalty. It was a promise written in ink by a ghost, and I was the executioner appointed to deliver it. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the penthouse was the faint rhythmic hum of the climate control system and the ragged, uneven breathing of my mother. Then Richard's survival instinct violently overrode his pride. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch completely shattered. He threw his hands up into the air, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of panic fury and desperate submission. He had spent his entire life treating human beings like business transactions, and he clearly believed this was just another negotiation. He thought there was a bottom line to be met. "Fine," Richard shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "Fine. We are sorry, we are monsters. Is that what you want to hear, Nora? What do we have to do to get the money? Do you want us in therapy? Do you want a public apology printed in the Times? Do you want us on our knees? Name your price, Nora. Just tell us the conditions of the trust so we can sign the damn papers." Beatrice nodded frantically beside him, her perfectly manicured hands clasped together in a posture of begging. "Yes, Nora. We will do whatever it takes. Just tell us what Josephine wanted us to do." I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply turned away from their pathetic display and walked toward the heavy, reinforced steel drawers built directly into the base of the marble island. I entered a digital passcode on the concealed keypad. The drawer slid open with a smooth, heavy glide. I reached inside and pulled out a massive black leather-bound financial ledger. I dropped it onto the marble counter. The sound was like a gunshot. I reached in again and pulled out a second ledger, dropping it squarely on top of the first. Another heavy, definitive thud echoed through the room. I reached in one final time, pulling out a third exceptionally thick ledger. I slammed it down onto the stack. A small cloud of dust danced in the recessed lighting. The three massive books towered on the island, a physical monument to their impending ruin. "You still think this is a game of jumping through hoops," I said, resting my hands flat on the top ledger. "You think Aunt Josephine left behind a checklist of apologies and good deeds for you to complete before I hand over a check? You fundamentally misunderstand who I am and what I do for a living." I walked slowly around the island, pacing like a predator circling a wounded herd. "When you threw me out, you told everyone I was a delinquent." I continued, my voice steady and cold. "You said I had no drive, no future, and no intelligence. You were wrong about a lot of things, Beatrice, but you were completely wrong about my capacity for work. I did not just survive in Europe. I became a crisis liquidator." Andre frowned, his slick tech bro facade faltering. "A what?" "A vulture, Andres," I clarified, stopping right in front of him. "A corporate undertaker. When a company is drowning in toxic debt, when they have leveraged everything they own, when their executives are bleeding the accounts dry and facing bankruptcy, I step in. I do not rescue them. I buy their distressed debt for absolutely pennies on the dollar through shell corporations. I become their sole creditor. And then I tear them apart for parts. I liquidate their assets, I seize their properties, and I leave the executives with absolutely nothing." I turned my gaze back to my father. He was staring at the black ledgers, his breathing shallow and rapid. "It is a ruthless, unforgiving profession, Dad," I said. "It requires a complete lack of empathy. It requires you to look at a desperate person begging for their livelihood and feel absolutely nothing as you sign the foreclosure papers." Aunt Josephine saw that talent in me early on. She cultivated it. She paid for my education so I could perfect it. Caroline crawled forward on her knees, her tear-streaked face looking up at me in pure desperation. "Nora, please, I have nothing to do with Mom and Dad's businesses. I do not have toxic debt. Just give me my portion of the trust. I will leave and you will never have to see me again. I swear." I looked down at my older sister, feeling a profound, chilling emptiness where my familial love should have been. "You wore the winter coat they stole out of my closet the day they kicked me out, Caroline," I stated bluntly. "You laughed from the back seat of the car when they left me at the train station. Do not pretend you are collateral damage. You are a participant." Richard stepped in front of his precious golden child, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger at the stack of books. "What are those, Nora? What are in those ledgers? You said the 15 million was the bait. What is the actual trap? Stop talking in riddles and tell me what you want from me to release the funds." I closed the distance between us until I was standing inches from his chest. He was taller than me, but he looked incredibly small. His eyes were wide with a terror he could no longer hide behind his tailored suits and country club bluster. He was completely at my mercy, and he finally knew it. I leaned in close, lowering my voice so that only he could hear the absolute finality of his doom. "You still do not get it, Dad." I whispered the words, sharp as razor blades. "You are not getting the $15 million. I have already spent it." Richard recoiled as if I had struck him. He stared at me, his mouth open, his mind desperately trying to process the words I had just spoken. "Spent it," he stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh, reedy whisper. "What do you mean you spent it? You cannot just spend $15 million of trust capital. That is embezzlement. That is a federal crime." Beatrice shrieked, her hands flying to the sides of her face. "You stole it. You bought this penthouse. You bought designer clothes. You stole our inheritance to play dress up." "I did not steal anything," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I followed Aunt Josephine's instructions to the exact letter. I grabbed the top ledger, flipping it open so hard the heavy binding cracked. I spun it around, sliding it across the smooth marble island until it stopped right in front of Richard. "Clause 6 of the trust deed," I stated, tapping my index finger against the bold print at the top of the page. Josephine did not leave a cash inheritance. She left a highly restricted, heavily mandated acquisition fund. I watched Richard's eyes dart down to the page. I could see the exact moment his brain registered the legal terminology. I decided to read it aloud for the rest of the room. "The $15 million principal shall not be distributed as liquid capital. It shall be utilized exclusively by the appointed trustee to acquire in full the distressed, defaulting, and underwater liabilities of Richard, Beatrice, Caroline, and Andre. The trustee is legally mandated to purchase this debt and assume the position of sole primary creditor." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb dropping milliseconds before the shockwave tears a building apart. Andre was the first to understand the magnitude of the trap. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored suit. He stumbled forward, gripping the edge of the island. "You bought our debt!" Andre breathed out, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Every single penny of it," I confirmed. "I am a crisis liquidator, Andre. My entire firm specializes in buying toxic assets through anonymous shell companies. It took me 6 months of quiet, meticulous negotiations, but I found every single one of your creditors. And because your financials are an absolute disaster, they were thrilled to sell your paper to me at a steep discount." I opened the second ledger, slamming it down next to the first. "Richard and Beatrice Wilson," I announced, pointing to the meticulously organized columns. "You took out massive high-interest loans against your manufacturing plants to fund your country club lifestyle. You have defaulted on the last 3 payments. The bank was preparing to foreclose next week." I stepped in. "I bought the entire commercial loan portfolio. The bank no longer holds the mortgage on your business or your primary residence." "I do." Richard gripped his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack right there in my kitchen. I opened the third ledger, turning my gaze to my sister, Caroline Blackwell. I continued, keeping my tone strictly professional. "You have 7 maxed-out premium credit cards. You have 2 asset-backed loans severely in arrears. You even pawned Beatrice's antique diamond brooches to a private dealer in the Diamond District to make your minimum payments. I bought the credit card debt. I bought the loans. I even went to the dealer and purchased the pawn tickets." Caroline let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail, dropping her face into her hands. I turned back to Andre. He was already backing away from the island, his eyes wide with a pure primal terror. "And then there is your brilliant artificial intelligence startup, Andre," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You could not secure traditional venture capital because your technology does not actually exist. So you took a Series B bridge loan from a group of aggressive private investors." Andre shook his head frantically. "Nora, please, do not say it out loud. You borrowed $3 million from a cartel front company," I stated clearly, letting the words ring through the penthouse. "They were going to kill you, Andre. They were going to break your legs, liquidate your assets, and bury you in a landfill. But cartel accountants are still accountants. When my shell corporation offered them $2 million in clean, untraceable offshore cash for your debt, they happily signed the promissory notes over to me. I stepped back from the island, looking at the four people who had tormented me for my entire life. They were entirely broken. They were stripped of their pride, their arrogance, and their illusions of wealth. To summarize the current financial landscape, I said, my voice slicing through their sobbing and hyperventilating. Debtor asset / debt acquired current status. Richard and Beatrice commercial real estate and primary mortgage defaulted. Foreclosure imminent. Caroline, unsecured credit lines and pawn contracts. Severely delinquent. Assets seized. Andre private promissory notes. Fraudulent. Called due immediately. We are ruined, Richard whispered, his knees finally giving out. He sank to the hardwood floor, his hands resting limply in his lap. We have absolutely nothing. Beatrice fell to her knees beside him, clutching his arm, weeping uncontrollably. Caroline was curled into a ball in the corner, rocking back and forth. Andre simply stared at the wall, completely catatonic. But the delusion of their entitlement was a stubborn disease. Richard slowly looked up at me from the floor. His eyes were red and watery, but a tiny pathetic flicker of hope still burned inside them. Nora, he pleaded, his voice breaking. You are our creditor now. You hold the paper. That means you can forgive the debt. You can cancel the loans. You can give us a clean slate. We are your family. We are begging you. I reached into the thickest ledger and pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents. They were the formal transfer deeds, the foreclosure notices, and the immediate demands for repayment. The paperwork of their absolute destruction. I slid the legal documents across the cold marble island. They stopped right at the edge, hovering above Richard's tear-stained face. I did not bring you here to give you money, I said, staring down at the man who had bet $100 on my death. I brought you here to inform you that I am your sole creditor. I own you. The absolute silence in the penthouse stretched until it became a physical weight pressing down on the room. Richard and Beatrice remained on the hardwood floor, effectively paralyzed by the magnitude of their financial ruin. I did not give them a moment to recover. I turned my attention away from my broken parents and shifted my gaze directly to my sister. Caroline was still huddled in the corner, her expensive silk dress wrinkled, her breathing shallow and erratic. I picked up a heavy crimson folder from the stack on the marble island. I tossed it across the smooth surface. It slid with a sharp scraping sound and stopped exactly at the edge, hovering just inches above Caroline. Open it, Caroline, I commanded, my voice echoing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Read your future. She flinched as if the folder was laced with poison. Slowly, her trembling hands reached up and pulled the heavy crimson file down from the counter. She peeled back the cover. I watched her perfectly lined eyes scan the first page. I watched the exact second her brain processed the heavy black legal text at the top of the document. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Caroline let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. That document details the immediate foreclosure of your Pacific Heights estate, I explained, leaning my weight against the marble island. Your primary mortgage was severely in arrears, Caroline. You have not made a payment in 7 months. My firm purchased that debt package last Tuesday. The grace period expired at midnight. As of this morning, you no longer own that property. She frantically flipped to the next page, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. Order of repossession. Your custom Mercedes G-Wagon and the vintage Porsche 911 are heavily leveraged, I continued smoothly. You use them as collateral for a short-term high-yield personal loan to cover your country club dues and your luxury vacations. That loan is currently in default. The recovery agents have already been dispatched. If those vehicles are not currently parked in your driveway, they will track them down via GPS by the end of the business day. Caroline dropped the folder onto the floor. The papers spilled out over the Persian rug, exposing pages upon pages of asset liquidation schedules, seized bank accounts, and pawn shop buyout receipts. For her entire life, Caroline had built her identity around looking down on me. I remembered standing in the hallway of our childhood home wearing faded, ill-fitting clothes from a discount store, watching her preen in front of the mirror in a $2,000 prom dress. She used to tell her affluent friends that I was the housekeeper's daughter. She used to laugh at the small, cramped apartment the foster system eventually placed me in, calling it a rat trap. Now she sat on the floor of a $50 million penthouse, staring at documents that proved the sister she deemed a peasant literally owned the roof over her head. Her pristine, untouchable socialite existence was completely obliterated. She was for all intents and purposes entirely homeless and bankrupt. "You cannot do this," Caroline wailed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You cannot take my home. You cannot take my cars. My friends will see. My social circle will know. I will be a laughingstock. You are a monster, Nora. You are a vindictive, disgusting monster." I simply stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. "The bank was going to take it all anyway, Caroline. I just made sure the deed transferred to a company I control. You did this to yourself. I merely bought the receipt." Before Caroline could launch into another hysterical fit, Andre suddenly snapped out of his catatonic shock. The sheer panic of facing cartel debt had temporarily broken his mind, but the slick, arrogant tech CEO finally rebooted. He pushed himself off the edge of the island, his face twisting into a mask of aggressive, desperate defiance. "This is illegal," Andre barked, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You are trying to intimidate us with smoke and mirrors, Nora. You cannot legally enforce cartel paper in a United States federal court. It is a fabricated derivative. It is predatory lending. I will hire a team of corporate litigators, and we will tie this up in court for a decade. We will bleed you dry with legal fees until you drop the claims." I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip, as I watched him try to reclaim his power. It was almost sad how little he understood about the world he had recklessly stepped into. "You truly are a terrible businessman," Andre, I replied, setting the glass down. "You are throwing out legal buzzwords without understanding the contracts you blindly signed. The entity you borrowed that $3 million from was not listed as a cartel. It was a legally registered, fully compliant, limited liability company incorporated in Delaware." Andre opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off, my voice turning to ice. "You signed a cognizant note, Andre." I slammed my hand down onto his specific ledger. "A confession of judgment clause. By defaulting on the initial terms of the loan, you legally authorize the creditor to enter a judgment against you without a trial, without a hearing, and without any prior notice. You entirely waived your right to a legal defense." Andre froze, the blood draining from his face once again. "The moment my shell corporation acquired that note, I filed it with the courts. I stated stepping around the island until there was nothing between us. The judgment is already entered. There will be no decade of litigation. There will be no corporate lawyers saving you. Your personal and business accounts were frozen worldwide at exactly 8 a.m. this morning. Your artificial intelligence startup is officially in receivership, and I am the receiver." Andre staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing as his brain finally comprehended the absolute airtight finality of his ruin. The walls were closing in on him. He had stolen millions, faked his company's technology, and now the exit door was permanently welded shut. "You freak!" Andre screamed, the sophisticated veneer completely burning away, leaving only a cornered, violent animal. "You defective, worthless freak. You think you can do this to me. I will kill you. I will tear you apart." He lost his mind. He let out a feral roar and lunged across the open space, his hands reaching directly for my throat. I did not flinch. I did not even step back. Before Andre could cross half the distance between us, the deep shadows near the private elevator vestibule violently shifted. Two massive, heavily armed security guards stepped into the light, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The first guard intercepted Andre's lunge, driving a heavy shoulder directly into the man's chest. The impact lifted Andre completely off his feet. The second guard grabbed Andre by the collar of his custom navy suit and slammed him face first into the hardwood floor with bone-rattling force. Andre screamed in pain as his arms were immediately wrenched behind his back and pinned securely against his spine. The heavy knee of the lead guard pressed down hard between his shoulder blades, locking him entirely in place. Andre thrashed violently against the polished hardwood floor, spitting vicious curses and gasping for air. The lead security guard did not speak or flinch. He merely shifted his weight, driving his heavy knee deeper into Andre's spine until a sharp, terrifying crack echoed through the wide expanse of the penthouse, followed instantly by a breathless whimper. I adjusted the cuffs of my blouse, completely unfazed by the physical violence playing out at my feet. I did not even grant my brother-in-law a second glance. The brute force was necessary to secure the room, but physical intimidation was not my chosen weapon. My attention was now entirely reserved for the two architects of my childhood misery. I picked up the remaining two crimson folders from the stack on the marble island. They were exceptionally thick, pregnant with decades of financial mismanagement, reckless leveraging, and unmitigated greed. I walked around the counter, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, stepping directly over Andre's pinned and trembling legs. Richard and Beatrice were still kneeling on the Persian rug, clutching each other like desperate survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood. I dropped the folders onto the floor right between them. They hit the ground with a heavy, definitive smack. "Read them," I commanded. Richard reached out with a trembling, liver-spotted hand. He pulled back the heavy cover of the first folder. His eyes widened, darting frantically back and forth across the pages as his brain tried to reject the undeniable legal reality printed in black ink. "You leveraged everything, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, conversational, and entirely devoid of pity. "When your manufacturing plant started failing 10 years ago, you did not downsize. You refused to adjust your lifestyle. You doubled down. You took out massive commercial loans using the factories as collateral. Then you took out secondary high-yield loans just to pay the staggering interest on the first set. When the traditional banks finally cut you off, you went to aggressive private equity firms." I pointed the toe of my shoe at the second folder. Beatrice, sensing the axe falling, squeezed her eyes shut and refused to look down. "Open it, Mother," I ordered. Richard opened the second file for her. He gasped out loud, dropping the papers instantly as if they had burned his fingers. "You put up the family estate," I stated, feeling a profound, icy sense of satisfaction, watching the realization sink into their bones. The ancestral mansion, the luxury cars, the art collection, the private trust accounts you set up for yourselves. Aunt Josephine's trust capital allowed me to purchase every single one of those underwater notes. I own the factories. I own the land they sit on. The liquidation process began exactly 48 hours ago. Your machinery is currently being auctioned off to overseas buyers. The locks on the estate are being changed at dawn." Beatrice let out a primal, guttural scream. The carefully constructed mask of high society elegance shattered entirely, leaving behind a terrified, broken woman. She clawed at Richard's suit jacket, shaking him, demanding that he call someone to fix this. When he offered nothing but a vacant, horrified stare, she turned her hysterical gaze back to me. "You cannot do this to us," Beatrice screeched, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You cannot take our home. We are your parents. Where are we supposed to go? We will be completely homeless. You are throwing your own flesh and blood out onto the street." I slowly crouched down until my face was perfectly level with hers. The smell of her expensive jasmine perfume turned my stomach, bringing back a flood of toxic memories. "Homeless," I repeated, rolling the word around in my mouth as if tasting it. What an absolutely terrifying concept for a woman wearing a $5,000 silk gown. "You have no idea what that word actually means, Beatrice." "But I do." My voice dropped to a lethal whisper, cutting right through her sobbing. "I remember exactly what it feels like to be homeless. I was 13 years old. I remember standing on the icy concrete of that regional train station, watching the bright red taillights of your luxury vehicle disappear into the blizzard. I had exactly $0 in my pocket. I had no winter coat. I had absolutely nowhere to go. And while I was shivering so violently I thought my bones would snap, you were sitting in a heated leather seat laughing out loud about a $100 bet." Richard suddenly shoved Beatrice aside. The sheer panic in his chest mutated into a desperate, cornered fury. He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly, trying to look down at me in a pathetic attempt to regain his lost authority. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you have outsmarted me?" Richard snarled, his voice thick with spite. "You think buying my debt gives you total control? I have played this game far longer than you have, Nora. You are a rookie vulture. I will call my corporate attorneys the second I walk out of this building. I will file for Chapter 11 protection tomorrow morning. I will declare total corporate and personal bankruptcy. A federal judge will freeze all your collection attempts immediately. You will be stuck fighting me in a courtroom for a decade, and you will eventually be forced to settle for pennies on the dollar." I will walk away clean and you will have wasted Josephine's entire fortune for absolutely nothing. I slowly stood up, brushing a microscopic speck of dust from my tailored trousers. I looked at the man who had tormented me, manipulated me, and discarded me like trash. I smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile. You cannot declare bankruptcy. Dad, I said softly. Richard sneered, his chest heaving. Watch me. I shook my head, stepping right into his personal space, refusing to let him look away. I did not just buy your debt. I audited it. When you took out those desperate final bridge loans last year, your company was already insolvent. To secure the funding, you deliberately inflated your asset valuations. You fabricated your revenue projections. You completely forged the collateral documentation. Aunt Josephine's lawyers anticipated this exact scenario. They made sure the specific loans I acquired were directly tied to personal criminal liability clauses. Richard stopped breathing. The color washed completely out of his face, leaving him a ghastly translucent white. His hand dropped to his side. Wire fraud, Dad. I clarified cheerfully, driving the final nail into his coffin. Bank fraud. Falsifying financial records to secure massive loans across state lines. If you file for bankruptcy, a federal trustee will immediately audit your books. The fraud will be discovered on day one. If you default on me, you do not get to go to bankruptcy court. I leaned in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his terrified skin. You go to federal prison. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade that had finally dropped. Richard collapsed inward. He did not physically fall, but his posture, his manufactured arrogance, and his entire identity simply crumbled into dust. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the velvet sofa before he sank heavily onto the cushions. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He stared blankly at the far wall, a completely broken man who had just realized his own colossal hubris was his executioner. He was not going to negotiate his way out of this. He was going to a federal penitentiary. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. This was not her usual theatrical display engineered to solicit sympathy from the country club wives. This was a genuine oxygen-starved panic attack. She realized instantly that the galas, the luxury shopping accounts, the high society lunches, and the pristine reputation she had cultivated for decades were completely vaporized. Social death terrified her far more than financial ruin. She clawed at the high collar of her silk blouse, her chest heaving rapidly as she gasped for air. She dropped to the floor beside Richard, grabbing his knees, shaking him violently, begging him to fix it, to call their lawyers, to do something. He did not even blink. Across the room, Caroline was curled into a tight fetal position on the Persian rug. The golden child, the flawless socialite who had never worked a day in her life, was sobbing uncontrollably. Her tears left dark, ugly stains on the expensive fabric of her designer dress. Her manicured hands tore at her own perfectly styled hair. She was mourning the sudden violent loss of her Pacific Heights mansion, her vintage sports cars, and her entire fabricated existence. She scrambled forward on her knees, her hands grasping desperately at the scattered foreclosure notices on the floor, as if she could physically erase the ink with her fingertips. Near the private elevator vestibule, the heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the room. The two security guards yanked Andre up by his shoulders, his arms locked securely and painfully behind his back. He let out a pathetic, defeated groan, his face bruised and swelling from where it had met the hardwood. He writhed against their grip, but the guards were immovable professionals. He was panting heavily, a string of saliva hanging from his bottom lip, entirely stripped of his slick, tech visionary bravado. He was no longer a CEO. He was just a terrified fraud waiting for the authorities to arrive. Absolute chaos had consumed the penthouse, yet I had never felt more completely at peace. I stood perfectly still in the center of the destruction, breathing in the sterile, climate-controlled air. I looked at the four of them, letting the silence stretch until the sheer gravity of their ruin forced them to look back at me. Even Caroline stopped rocking, looking up from the floor with red, swollen eyes. 14 years ago, I began my voice carrying the steady rhythmic cadence of a metronome. You drove me to the regional train station in the middle of a January blizzard. You did not let me pack a bag. You did not let me take my winter coat from the hall closet. You dragged me out of the car, dumped me on the icy concrete, and told me I was a worthless parasite who was finally being cut off from the family wealth. I walked slowly toward Richard, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. You thought I could not hear you over the wind, Dad? I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper, but I heard every single word. You pulled a crisp $100 bill out of your wallet, handed it to Beatrice, and laughed. You bet her $100 that I would not survive the cold. You bet that I would be back at the front estate gates by morning, begging on my hands and knees to be let back inside. You wanted me to break. You needed me to break to validate your own twisted sense of superiority. I stopped right in front of him. He slowly raised his heavy head, his vacant bloodshot eyes finally meeting mine. But I did not break, I stated clearly. I survived. Aunt Josephine found me shivering on that platform. She took me to Europe. She gave me an education, but more importantly, she gave me a purpose. When she passed away and left me the $15 million in trust capital, she did not just leave me a bank account. She left me a mandate to prove exactly who you people really are. I turned on my heel, addressing the entire room. You want to blame me for your destruction? I said, my voice rising, filling every corner of the vast penthouse. You want to look at me and see a vindictive monster who stole your lives. But I did not force Richard to commit systemic bank fraud. I did not force Beatrice to leverage the ancestral family estate to buy meaningless status symbols. I did not force Caroline to max out premium credit cards she could never pay back. And I certainly did not force Andre to take millions in cartel money for a fabricated software company. I swept my hand toward the thick black ledgers scattered across the marble island. I simply laid the trap and waited, I stated, embracing the absolute finality of my role. You bet $100 that a 13-year-old girl would freeze to death. I bet $15 million that you would completely destroy yourselves with your own unmitigated greed. I knew you could not resist taking the easy way out. I knew you would lie, cheat, and steal to maintain the grand illusion of your wealth. All I had to do was step back, watch you dig your own graves, and then buy the receipts. Beatrice let out another sharp, agonizing sob, burying her face in her hands. Richard simply closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his pale cheek. You built your entire lives on a foundation of sand and stolen money, I said, my tone shifting back to cold professional detachment. I am just the tide coming in to wash it all away. I won the bet. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. There was no more arguing. There were no more threats of litigation. The reality of their situation had finally crushed the last remaining ounces of their defiance. They were entirely at my mercy, and they knew I had absolutely none left to give. I raised my left arm, pulling back the crisp cuff of my silk blouse to check the face of my Cartier watch. I watched the sweeping second hand tick past the 12. It is exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I announced, dropping my arm back to my side and looking directly into Richard's eyes. Which means the asset seizure teams have just finished changing the locks on all your homes. Richard let out a hollow, raspy sound that barely registered as a breath. The reality of his locked doors and seized assets finally broke the last remaining mechanism in his brain. He slumped forward, his forehead nearly resting on the expensive Persian rug. It is time for you to leave my property, I said. I raised 2 fingers, giving a sharp, subtle flick of my wrist toward the private elevator vestibule. The 2 security guards who had pinned Andre to the floor immediately hauled him to his feet. Andre groaned, his arms still wrenched painfully behind his back. The fight had completely drained out of him. He hung limp between the 2 massive men, his expensive loafers dragging against the polished hardwood. Take our guests to the elevator, I instructed the guards. They have overstayed their welcome. 2 more security personnel stepped out from the hallway shadows, moving with silent efficiency. One grabbed Caroline by the upper arm, hauling her off the floor. She did not even attempt to resist. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, staring straight ahead at nothing as she was pulled toward the exit. The other guard stepped behind Richard, hooking his hands under my father's armpits and dragging him upward. Richard moved like a puppet with cut strings. No, Beatrice screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and desperate. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the guards entirely. She lunged toward me, her perfectly manicured fingers outstretched, desperately grasping for the hem of my trousers. Nora, please! She sobbed, tears ruining her immaculate makeup, leaving dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks. You cannot do this to us. You are my daughter. You are my baby girl. Please look at me. I am your mother. We are your family. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling myself entirely out of her reach. Her fingers clawed empty air. I looked down at her, feeling a profound wave of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. Do not ever call me that, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. You lost the right to call me your baby girl 20 years ago. You lost that right the second you watched me drag a garbage bag full of my belongings down the driveway while you sipped champagne in the foyer. You ceased being my mother the moment you decided my existence was an inconvenience to your social climbing. I gestured to the guard holding Richard. Take her too. The guard released one of Richard's arms, stepping forward to grab Beatrice by the shoulder. He hauled her upright without an ounce of gentleness. She thrashed against his grip, sobbing hysterically, but she was no match for a trained professional. The procession of my ruined family moved slowly toward the heavy oak doors of the private elevator. I walked behind them, keeping a measured distance, ensuring they were completely escorted off the premises. As we passed the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the western wall of the penthouse, I stopped. The sky outside had turned a bruised, metallic gray. Tiny white flakes were swirling through the air, sticking to the reinforced glass. Look outside, Richard, I commanded. The guard holding him paused, forcing my father to turn his head toward the glass. Richard stared out at the gray sky, his eyes vacant. It is snowing, I observed, my voice carrying a poetic, icy finality. It is exactly the same weather we had on the day you drove me to the station. Do you remember the cold, Dad? I remember it vividly. I remember the ice biting through my thin sweater. I remember the frost accumulating on my eyelashes. I remember the exact shade of gray the sky turned right before you drove away. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away from the window. He could not look at the snow. He could not face the physical manifestation of his own cruelty. Keep moving, I told the guards. The heavy oak doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft, melodic chime. The interior of the elevator was lined with mirrored panels and brushed steel. The guards shoved Richard and Beatrice inside first. Caroline was pushed in right behind them, stumbling blindly into the back corner. The two guards holding Andre threw him forward. He crashed into his father-in-law, both men tangling together in a pathetic heap of tailored suits and shattered egos. The guards immediately stepped back, planting their feet firmly on the penthouse floor, forming an impenetrable human wall between my family and my sanctuary. Andre scrambled to his knees, leaning heavily against the mirrored wall of the elevator. His face was a mess of bruises and smeared blood from where he had been pinned to the floor. The sheer terror of his impending arrest finally broke through his shock. He looked out at me, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. Nora, Andre yelled, his voice echoing loudly inside the metal box. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. You seized our bank accounts. You took the houses. We have absolutely nothing. We have no cash. We have no credit. We have nowhere to go. I stood perfectly still, looking at the four people cowering inside the elevator. They were stripped of their wealth, their power, and their malicious pride. They were exactly what they had always feared becoming. They were nothing. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers. My fingers brushed against a crisp, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, holding it up between my index and middle fingers. It was a perfectly unblemished $100 bill. I flicked my wrist. The bill fluttered through the air, gliding gracefully past the security guards. It drifted down into the elevator, landing gently on the brushed steel floor right between Andre's bruised hands. Here is the $100 you won from your bet, I stated, staring dead into Richard's terrified eyes. Let us see if you can find your way home. I pressed the button on the wall. The heavy steel doors began to glide shut. Beatrice let out one final agonizing scream, lunging forward, but the doors sealed tightly together with a definitive mechanical click. I stood in the quiet of my penthouse, listening to the faint hum of the elevator descending toward the lobby. The air was clean. The silence was perfect. The past was finally liquidated. The heavy steel doors sealed shut with a soft, definitive hiss, trapping their panicked cries inside the descending metal box. I stood perfectly still for a long, quiet minute, simply listening to the mechanical hum fade into absolute nothingness. The digital floor indicator above the elevator blinked as it tracked their rapid descent from the penthouse down to the lobby, down to the freezing street level, and entirely out of my life. The security guards silently gathered their radios and stepped back into the service corridors, giving me a respectful nod before melting away. The penthouse, which had just been a battlefield of shattered egos, desperate screaming, and pathetic begging, returned to its natural state of immaculate tranquility. I took a deep, deliberate breath. The air smelled of expensive polished wood and the crisp, clean ozone scent of the incoming snowstorm pressing against the reinforced glass. It did not smell like Beatrice's suffocating, cloying jasmine perfume anymore. It did not smell like Richard's arrogant, stale cigars or Andre's terrified sweat. The toxicity had been physically, legally, and permanently excised from my sanctuary. I unclasped my hands, feeling the rigid tension drain out of my shoulders, out of my spine, and out of my very bones. The decades-long war was finally over. I was the only one left standing. I turned my back on the private elevator vestibule and walked across the vast expanse of the living room. My heels sank slightly into the plush Persian rug, the exact spot where Caroline had just wept for her superficial, fabricated existence. I bypassed the scattered crimson folders on the marble kitchen island, leaving the heavy documentation of their total financial ruin for the cleaning staff to sweep away in the morning. I approached the custom-built mahogany bar tucked into the corner of the room. I reached for a bottle of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon, peeling back the foil and uncorking it with practiced ease. The dark, rich liquid poured into the heavy crystal goblet with a satisfying rhythmic splash. I picked up the glass, feeling the cool, solid weight of it in my hand, and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan stretched out beneath me, an endless, sprawling grid of concrete steel and brilliant city lights. The bruised gray sky had completely opened up over the city. Thick, heavy flakes of snow were falling rapidly, swirling in the wind and blanketing the chaotic streets in a pristine layer of white. It was a violent, beautiful storm burying the grime of the city under a cold, immaculate silence. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the complex, bold flavors ground me firmly in the present moment. I watched the snow whip violently against the glass, feeling perfectly insulated from the freezing temperatures outside. My mind drifted entirely away from Richard, Beatrice, and Caroline. They were no longer my concern. Their future was the cold street, the federal auditors, and the harsh reality of the poverty they had always mocked. My thoughts turned instead to the incredible woman who had pulled me out of the storm 2 decades ago. Aunt Josephine had not just given me a thick winter coat and a warm bed when I had nothing. She had given me a spine made of reinforced steel. She recognized the broken, shivering 13-year-old girl on that desolate train platform and flatly refused to let her remain a victim. While Beatrice taught me that love was conditional, and Richard taught me that worth was measured in cruelty, Josephine taught me how to survive. She taught me how to read complex financial statements before I was old enough to drive. She taught me how to leverage assets, how to identify corporate weakness, and how to weaponize patience. She showed me that real family does not demand your total subservience in exchange for their basic affection. Real family nurtures your independence and applauds your strength. I raised my crystal glass, holding it up toward the swirling white sky in a silent, solitary tribute. I drank to Aunt Josephine. I drank to her fierce intelligence, her unapologetic independence, and her enduring, magnificent legacy. And as I swallowed the wine, looking out over the freezing city, I felt a profound foundational sense of closure settle deep into my chest. The scared, freezing child I had been all those years ago was finally permanently safe. The ghosts of the past could no longer reach her. I turned away from the snowy panorama of the city, looking directly forward, addressing the invisible audience that had followed this entire grueling journey. Society feeds us a persistent toxic lie about blood relations. We are conditioned from birth to believe that we owe our absolute loyalty, our hard-earned resources, and our sanity to the people who happen to share our genetic code. We are repeatedly told to forgive the unforgivable, to endure the intolerable, and to turn the other cheek, all in the name of keeping the family intact. But blood does not entitle anyone to your soul. Family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unyielding support, and genuine love. If the people who raised you only view you as a convenient scapegoat, an endless bank account, or a stepping stone for their own massive egos, they are not your family. They are simply your biological captors. True power does not come from tearing others down to elevate yourself, which was the only pathetic strategy my parents ever understood. True power comes from building yourself up from the absolute bottom. It comes from taking the heavy bricks they threw at you with the intention of breaking you and using them instead to construct a fortress they can never penetrate. I did not actively destroy them today. I simply stopped holding up the fragile walls of their own corrupt, greedy illusions. I let gravity do the work. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes they are the ones willing to leave you in the cold. But the best part about being left in the cold, you learn how to build your own fire. Have you ever had to lock the door on toxic relatives? Tell me your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of sweet absolute justice. The core lesson learned from this story is that shared biology does not guarantee unconditional love, nor does it obligate you to endure perpetual abuse. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and psychological safety. When Nora was abandoned in a literal and metaphorical blizzard, she discovered that surviving a toxic environment often requires severing ties completely. By refusing to internalize her family's cruelty, she transformed her deepest trauma into an impenetrable fortress of success. You must protect your peace, even if it means walking away from the people who raised you. Please share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below.